Please join me in welcoming Krzysztof Borowski. Thank you very much for coming. This is our, I think, second lecture in the Polish series. So this has worked out quite well in conjunction with Professor Wood's lecture. And the floor is yours.
Growing stronger. Thank you. So today I'll be talking about ethnic ideologies and othering in contemporary Poland based on my dissertation research. But before we get there, we need to start with the question, is Poland a Western country? Which, funny enough, is an interesting one because just recently Poland has been upgraded by financial institutions to a developed market as the first of the post-Soviet countries from the post-Soviet sphere of influence. So I'd like to start with this tweet and the exchange that followed. So exactly 1 month ago, Ukraine was celebrating its Independence Day, and on that occasion, Chrystia Freeland, who is responsible for Canada's foreign affairs, tweeted that Canada was the first Western country to recognize Ukraine's independence. And that prompted some Twitter users to say that, well, you know what, it was actually Poland, which is what we have here right below. And the user adds, yes, Poland is a Western country, in case there were any doubts. That obviously followed. So I looked at two different discussions, all spreading from one tweet. So the same idea is repeated here above, and then below we have an exchange between two users. So one of them again says, well, it was Poland, wasn't Canada, whereas the response is, she said in the West, and then Poland is an Eastern European country. So quite a conundrum. And then here in the top left corner, we have a Twitter user, saying that, well, you know what? Actually, given what's been happening in Poland recently, Poland is really not a Western country, only of the early medieval West. That's obviously a quote. To which that user on the right says, yes, it is part of Western Europe, it's just on its east side. And then finally I have this tweet from Andrew Robinson, who used to be the ambassador of Canada to Ukraine, and who said that, well, while in 1991 it wasn't necessarily the case, nowadays Poland is indeed, without question, as he says, a Western country. Okay, so that obviously brings us to this whole Western versus Eastern Europe dynamic and rhetoric. So let me give you some theoretical background. I like to start with Tomasz Zarycki, who noticed that in terms of, or when talking about Polish identity, Western European elements are very important, and that in fact there's this tendency to overfocus or overemphasize Western influences in Polish national identity at the expense of any links or connections with Eastern Europe or Eastern European culture. And at the same time, he points to this idea of significant inferior other. So obviously, in terms when it comes to identity, identity is based on difference. What we have in here is that what's been happening in Poland and other Central European countries is that most of them or all of them seem to have a significant inferior other against which they can identify. So in the case of Poland, it is Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, so it's Eastern neighbors. Whereas in the case of Upper Silesia, which is also going to be the topic of my presentation today, it is, or it may be, for example, the Dąbrowa Basin, which is just across the river of Brynica, with Sosnowiec as the main city. And Sosnowiec used to be in the Russian section of partitioned Poland, which is going to be important later on. So moving on, it was also Zarycki who noted that Central and Eastern Europe seem to be prisoners of Said's Orientalism, in the sense that this region and countries in this region have been intensively Orientalized, but at the same time, it is also these countries where extensive production of Orientalist discourses takes place. And that is also the case for the Polish national identity. And that my presentation was also informed by Maria Kus's observations on the categories of Europe or Eastern Europe. So she noticed that in fact there is these categories are not really monolithic, but we can speak of several Europes and several Eastern Europes, depending again on where we're located and what our perceptions are. So hence a series of Europes and Eastern Europes. And that obviously also rings a bell in other scholars who try to theorize, East versus West, and the idea of Orientalism, or who took Said's ideas and then applied them to East Central Europe, such as Milica Bakić-Hayden, who talks about nesting Orientalisms and gradation of Orients. So obviously, Eastern, that is not Balkan Europe, is more Western than, say, Eastern Balkan Europe, which in turn is more Western than Asia, but still more Eastern than non-Balkan Eastern Europe. And the same can be applied to socio-historical past. So, for example, Bakić-Hayden notices that people who live in the former Habsburg lands actually think of themselves as somewhat superior to those who live in the former Ottoman lands, so on and so forth. And there's also, some of you may probably have some anecdotal evidence for that as well. But in my presentation, I'll be dealing with German versus Russian past. Okay, this is going to be the main dividing point in here. So my presentation is about East and West, or Eastern versus Western Europe, but instead of treating these as geographic directions or geospatial arrangements, I'll be taking these as really containers that can be filled with ideas that you wish to fill them with according to your agenda, according to what your agenda may be. So just like in sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology, we talk about language ideologies. So, those comments about language that are in fact comments about language speakers. In a similar way, I'll be talking about ideologies of space, or spatial ideologies, where comments about spaces de facto become comments about people somewhat linked in one way or another to those spaces. So the argument that I'll be trying to make in here is that the East versus West divide is exploited for identity work in my examples, and that results in some discriminatory practices that are then mirrored in language. So what I'll be using are online comments written by pro and anti-Silesian posters, extracted from discussions on Silesian identity from the Western Daily comments section. So the Western Daily, or in Polish Dziennik Zachodni, is the largest regional newspaper in the region of Upper Silesia, which is the eastern chunk of the overall historical region of Silesia. What that will get us to is, among other things, othering, which I think is or represents a way of challenging the unequal power relations between the two groups. So on one hand, we have pro and anti-Silesian posters, and then in the larger scheme of things, we have Silesians versus non-Silesians in general. Just a little note about pro versus anti-Silesian posters. So pro-Silesian posters is the label that I use to apply to those online posters who see or who think that Silesian identity as a thing on its own, that Silesians are a group on its own, that they cannot be easily, reduced or subsumed under the bigger category of being Polish. Okay, and then anti-Silesian posters are just those who disagree with the statement. In what follows, I'll be talking about othering broadly as really the discursive practice of constructing and delineating and maintaining in-groups and out-groups. And I take identity to be the social positioning of self and other. So also kind of a bigger or more broader approach. Okay, before we get into examples, I have this one quote, which I think works well as the overall model for what I'll be talking about. So one of the pro-Silesian posters said, well, this is because our history revolves around the sphere of Western influence and not that of a Russian gubernia or Russian province. Okay, so you can already, see here this kind of a clear-cut divide between us versus them, and this association of them with the East and Russia and so on and so forth, right? And on the right, what you can see is a obviously humoristic and ironic map of Poland according to Silesians. So Silesia is more or less based here, okay, so the southwest. So we have my, us, też my, us as well, chyba my, us, I guess, right? And that is because Upper Silesia is mostly is in here, and self-identified Silesians are mostly located in this part. So hence the question mark in here, I think. Notice the word that is applied here where Warsaw is the capital, so haracz, so kind of like ransom. And notice the label in here, so we have Warszawa Południe, meaning Warsaw South. So, in the imagination of the locals, Warsaw, that is non-Silesia, extends all the way up to here, which is again probably a pun at Sosnowiec, just across the river from Katowice. Okay, and then some interesting labels in the east. So we have Sibir, like Siberia, right? Probably because of the weather, but not necessarily only. Bagna, like marshes. And here to the east, steppes, or just steppes. Okay, so we already have some elements of this kind of a Orientalist, non-colonial, but Orientalist thinking in here. Okay, let's start looking at the examples. And start with this one. And just a trigger warning, some of these examples are pretty insulting and aggressive and disparaging in one way or another, so sorry for that. So this one was posted under an interview with a political scientist who said that, well, if you take the Polish Act on National and Ethnic Minorities and try to apply the situation of Silesians in nowadays Poland, you cannot say that they are a people, or naród in Polish. But what is interesting is what follows next. So the poster says that Germans and Czechs and Slovaks and Slovenes and Austrians and the Swiss think of Silesians as a people. And do you know why? Insult? Well, because we make up one family. Just like you, Pole, make up one family with Lithuanians, Ruthenians, whoever these may be, Ukrainians and others. Okay, so this again sets up the whole scene for this kind of a very clear division between us and them, between us and the East, which is disparaged. Okay, some more examples. So in 2, we have again a post that refers to Silesian uprisings, but as it usually is the case, people start talking about one thing and then just go on to talk about something else, usually about each other, or just end up insulting each other. So in 2, what the poster suggests is that, well, your family probably came barefoot all the way from beyond the Bug River, which is nowadays Belarus and Ukraine, and with one goat, and there are many more of such migrants here in our town. And then in 3, we have a kind of a bigger argument for why self-identified Silesians are distinctive from Poles or the rest of Poland. So the poster says that our local variety isn't really The only difference, because we in fact have a different mentality from yours, and that is because from the very beginning, again, Silesia was, under these Western influences, which cannot be said about the other side. So obviously, the other side refers to non-Silesia, whatever is outside of the region in this very case. Similar overtones we found in here. So here we have a commenter addressing the author of an editorial directly and saying that, well, you know what, even though many Poles were resettled from what is known as Eastern borderlands after the Second World War and came to live in Western Poland, they are still mentally, or in their psyche, Eastern. And so, again, we have this mapping of space onto people, onto some kind of a, whole psyche and identity. And that is why, they brought all those experiences and cognitive schemas and whatnot from such areas as Lithuania or the Grodno region or Podolia in present-day Ukraine. So again, we have this insertion of non-colonial but Orientalist-like thinking in here. Okay, and here the tone gets a little bit more agitated and or aggressive. So the poster starts with listen to me, you small letter Pole, and actually executes that. So the fact that in Polish, just like in English, you need to capitalize nationalities is not preserved, and here is already a way of insulting the addressee. And this is really regular throughout the whole post, even though, as you can see, Ślązak or Ślązoki is capitalized as it should be, right? And we have kind of like a mini lecture on the very same topic. So the poster asks that, in fact, few people in Europe seem to know, the argument goes, that Silesia belongs to Poland. All of Europe knows the history, and all of Europe knows that Silesia has only been for the last 67 years under, quote, Polish occupation. Okay, which is a theme that is very frequently employed by Silesian activists, though, who actually are politically active and strive at gaining autonomy for Silesia. And then the final punch. So Silesia is a region that is more well known than Poland. Notice the word for Poland is in German, and again, it is not capitalized. Okay, in the Russian partition. Okay, so just a clarification. So in late 18th century, Poland was partitioned between its three neighbors. So Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Okay, so the idea in here is that what is nowadays known as Poland is in fact, has some traces of this Russian-like mindset, which is supposed to be the result of Russian partitions. Okay, example number 6 is interesting because it does not come from any of the anonymous commenters, but instead it comes from a sociologist, Bogdan Jałowiecki, and because it fits well, into that whole narrative that anonymous people are producing on the internet, I thought I'd include it in here. So the question is, okay, so what's the difference between, Poles from Eastern Poland and Silesians? Well, in general, or generally speaking, we have some Western influences that are mirrored in specific work culture here. So the sociologist mentions solidity, order, diligence, which isn't necessarily the case for people brought up in the Russian partition or the Russian section of the partitioned Poland, even though partitions officially ended a century ago, right? So there probably aren't that many people who actually got to be born at a time. Okay, and this is why Eastern Poland is lagging behind, the argument goes, right? In 7, we have this really intriguing representation because the poster says that, the Eurasian homeland, okay, it is not European, it is Eurasian already, so, we're kind of pushing further east. Homeland of the Vistula land, Pole. Notice the word for Pole, is just using the Russian word, which is then, but using Polish orthography, so Paliaka, right? That it extends all the way from Sosnowiec, again Sosnowiec, just across the river, from Silesia, to the Primorski Kraj in Sakhalin. So, all the way to the Russian far east, all the way to the ocean. Now, what is the Vistula land? So that is a label that was applied to the westernmost section of Russian partitioned Poland, basically, right? So that part included present-day central Poland, including Warsaw and parts of eastern Poland, and it was used in the second half of 19th century. So an interesting thing is that I asked my Russian colleagues if they've ever heard of, Przemysliński Kraj or any phrases like that, and none of them knew what I was talking about. So, this kind of shows you that some of these posters go really to great lengths to make their claim and, dig deep into the history so as to be convincing that what they're trying to say is real. Okay, this is pretty fun. So at some point there was this grand test of Silesian history organized locally, and Zygmunt Woźniczka, who's a professor of history at the local university, was supervising it, among others. And in this particular edition, the test contained questions about the January uprising. So the January uprising happened in 1860s in, again, the Russian section of partitioned Poland. So what was outrageous for this and many other posters was that it doesn't really reflect our history. It doesn't really have anything to do with who we are or the historical experience of our ancestors, right? And so this post was produced in a really sarcastic and ironic manner. So the poster asks, did those Silesians play the balalaika? And if you are wondering, balalaika isn't really a thing in Poland or Silesia. And that goes on to explaining that, at a time in 1860s, Africa, due to, some Prussian geopolitics, was actually closer to us than, quote, this, Western Russian mess on steppes and marches. Okay, so, once again, we have this very clear picture and representation of what the other part of Poland is conceptualized like in the eyes of this poster.
When were these published?
These are very recent, and I'll actually have a timeline of my examples.
Like now?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
The only ones girls.
I guess.
Yes.
I mean, but they sign their name, Joseph Przemysliński.
No, that is not actually a username. That is a reference to.
Very familiar.
It is because Piłsudski is
I'm wondering, when did they?
right. So Piłsudski is known as the quote-unquote father of Polish independence after the First War. But most of the time, overwhelmingly, these comments are posted anonymously. In that you enter whatever you want as your nickname, and you just present whatever you think is right. So yeah, right, and that's a paraphrase of an actual quote from Piłsudski, because he was known for having a pretty sharp or using really sharp language himself. Okay, and moving on, almost done with the examples. So in 9, again, the overarching idea is that posters are discussing the Silesian Plebiscite and the vote that went 60% versus 40% for Germany, because at the end of the First World War, both Germany and Poland contested Silesia. So what the League of Nations eventually came up with was this plebiscite to help decide how the border is going to be drawn. And so obviously we have this whole setup about the uprising in here. And so what the poster eventually claims is that the majority voted for Germany precisely because they didn't feel like coming in touch with this Eastern steppe culture, quote unquote, again. Right, meaning obviously Poland, because it was a vote between Germany and Poland at a time. And then finally we have some similar. We have a similar example to what we've seen before that starts with Daragie kolegi. So again we have Russian all the way, right? Obviously the addressees are anti-Silesian posters, right? Please do not argue anymore, because all of you beyond that Brynica river, again that's the river that separates Sosnowiec outside of the historical region of Silesia and Katowice inside, right? Because all of you are this Przywislińcami. So the poster actually goes on and coins a new word, which I don't think I've ever seen in Polish through my whole life. And that obviously, gets at the whole idea of the Vistula land, right? So instead of talking about Poland, you are talking about Vistula land. Now, everybody knows Poland, or many people know Poland, but how many people know what Vistula land is, or what is Vistula in the first place, right? So, again, this is a way of decreasing the significance of your addressees in this particular case. And again, all the way, to the Bug River and Białystok here, again, kind of a Russianized form, right? So as you can see, these representations are pretty stable and predictable, and at the same time, they are pretty aggressive in introducing and maintaining this East versus West dynamic. And finally, an example that really stands out, because overwhelmingly what happens is that such ideologies of the East or Easternness, are used by pro-Silesian posters. However, sometimes the same tool can be used by anti-Silesian posters if there is a reason to do that. Okay, so what we have in here, the gentleman on the right is Jerzy Gorzelik, who's a professor of arts history and at the same time a leader of the Silesian autonomy movement. So here's a fact that we need to know. So from his paternal side of family, he comes from Silesia. However, from his maternal side of family, he comes from the, his origins are around Przemyśl, in the very east of Poland, close to the Polish-Ukrainian border. Okay, so this fact is used by a poster in here to obviously ridicule the person in question, right? And not only that, but we have a change of the name, so it's a very overt identity threat. So instead of Jerzy Gorzelik, we have Yuri Horilka. Horilka, just like alcohol, booze, right? Because Gorzelik stems from Gorzała, which is the same name, right? So his name gets Ukrainianized in a bit to use the same tool that's been used in this very form over and over again to ridicule and disparage the person, and obviously the idea of autonomy, because it also does get at the whole idea of autonomy for Silesia. Okay, so let me offer some conclusions. So as you can see from the timeline, my examples come from the period between 2011 and 2017. So they are all very recent. And if you were to open up a random news article on that very online edition of this newspaper and look at the comments, you will probably see those things happening over and over again. So this is not a one-time thing, or several separate episodes, because what I think we're dealing with in here is a both deliberate and consistent way of representing specific people and or spaces that is obviously mirrored in how these users talk about each other. So overall, what is happening in here is that posters really draw heavily from this civilizational rhetoric. So we all remember this idea of clash of civilizations, right? Which is really a thing these days. But still, a similar idea or ideas are used, again, to challenge and or subvert the unequal power relations between, self-identified Silesians who seek recognition, but get none, and then members of the Polish or non-Silesian majority in the country, right? And as I have shown elsewhere, this form of othering comes with specific, deliberate, ideologically saturated linguistic choices. So I don't really, have time to dig into more detail about that. But let me just tell you that while Russian and Russian-like forms are used with reference to anti-Silesian posters, right, because of their geospatial location, for example, those in the anti-Silesian camp most of the time use German for that very same purpose. Okay, so if we go above these specific examples and try to generalize, again we have this kind of a Germany versus Russia dichotomy on the bigger scheme of things. Okay, and as you have seen, what happens is that this rhetoric produces disparaging and aggressive and insulting, but still predictable representations of non-natives to Silesia in this particular case, whose Eastern, again assumedly Eastern character, is shown as totally and completely incompatible with that of the locals, right? And again, because of that, this East and West divide becomes part and parcel, really instrumental for the identity work of pro-Silesian posters that is executed linguistically. So as we have seen, the ideas of mental mapping or non-colonial Orientalism that Professor Wood referred to in his last week's lectures, which were already attested, among educated intellectuals from Western Europe in the Enlightenment, are still well and alive, I'd say, in contemporary Poland. So when we think about othering, we probably usually think about external others. But in this particular case, we're talking about internal others, and regardless of whether we're talking about the external or the internal, the mechanisms, the rhetorical tools that we use or can use, to talk about these groups still remain the same. And then some more talking points. So as we were obviously dealing with this Russian-Prussian partition boundary in here most of the time, but as I was telling you before, there was one more partitioner in place, right? So, a question that I asked myself, and I don't really have any answer to it, is where does that leave, the third partition, meaning this southeastern part of Poland that used to be Austrian. So, on one hand, it is obviously east of Silesia, right? Because Silesia, again, located in here. But on another hand, it was under Austrian rule, which probably nobody will deny that represents a Western European country or a Western culture. Just a thought. And then obviously, that also made me think of the idea of Poland composed of three unequal halves, as expressed in Stefan Żeromski's Przedwiośnie, which obviously is a reference to the fact that after the First World War, Poland became one country, but still had to deal with many specificities that were local to three different partitions, right? And this idea is obviously exaggerated in the examples that I've just presented to you. What also happens, and this is something that I've experienced, in my own life. So it's really part of popular discourse rather than public discourse on online discussion forums. So Ukraine becomes a label of Easternness that you can apply as long as there are conditions for that. So, for example, in Poland, there's a discipline called Speedway or żużel. Which is pretty popular, I'd say. And so two teams are located in the cities of Tarnów and Rzeszów. So Krakow, Tarnów, Rzeszów, right? Obviously Rzeszów more to the east than Tarnów, right? So what happens is that supporters of the Rzeszów team obviously get labeled as Ukrainians, right? But then, say we have a match between, the team from Tarnów with the team from Zielona Góra. Well, then, obviously those from Tarnów become labeled Ukrainians. Because, for us who live, say, I don't know, in Silesia, in Warsaw, in Łódź, wherever, this part, well, it's almost like Ukraine, right? Just like the city of Rzeszów and here is in Bieszczady in the popular mindset in Poland, which are mountains located in here. Which is obviously exaggerated, but still, tells you something about how people interact and or conceptualize space even within their own country. And that obviously brings us to the tension between the center and periphery. So there's this idea of Poland A versus Poland B in Poland, right? So Poland A is obviously supposed to be more developed, more Western, more liberal and all that, as opposed to Poland B, which is supposed to be this kind of a backward hinterland, which is more religious and so on and so forth. So one of these examples are, this kind of a tension that you can see between longtime residents of Warsaw, the capitals, and those who just came there to get a college degree or to get work, who are labeled as słoiki, meaning jars, because they work or study in the capital, and then on weekends they go back to wherever they're from, bringing with themselves, full jars of food, right? So, and that actually made into a docu story or a docu TV series on Polish TV, Słoiki. So that's what I was thinking about. So there's that, and then ultimately that makes me think of this broader position of Poland in Europe as this sort of a liminal space, because on one hand you have this very acute drive to the West, and you want to be Western, you don't want to be associated with the past or the Soviet Union or the communist period, but at the same time. When you go to Western Europe, for example, you still will get labeled as an Eastern European, and this is probably why somebody at some point came up with the idea of Central Europe, right? So what is Central Europe? Well, it's the West to the Eastern Europe, and it's the East to Western Europe, right? Yeah. So there's that, and these are my references, so thank you very much.